In the summer of 1982, the murky waters of a Washington state waterway surrendered a gruesome secret that would paralyze an entire region. Two young women, bound and strangled, were discovered beneath the surface, marking the terrifying genesis of a predator who would soon be known as the Green River Killer. This was not a localized anomaly, but the opening stanza of an unprecedented slaughter. The sheer volume of the dead would eventually overwhelm local law enforcement, transforming a dense, forested landscape into a sprawling graveyard. The true horror lay not just in the violence, but in the calculated selection of the targets. The perpetrator deliberately preyed upon the invisible. The victims were overwhelmingly young women, many of whom were runaways, sex workers, or vulnerable individuals struggling with addiction along the gritty Highway 99 corridor south of Seattle. By targeting those existing on the societal margins, the killer exploited a devastating systemic flaw. When a marginalized person vanishes, their absence is rarely met with immediate alarm bells or swift missing persons reports. This calculated victimology provided the killer with an invaluable, horrifying asset: time. Time allowed the trail to freeze before the police even knew a crime had occurred. Investigators were forced to work backward, constantly chasing ghosts whose last known whereabouts were weeks or even months in the past. The sprawling, transient nature of the Pacific Northwest in the 1980s further complicated the timeline. Establishing a concrete modus operandi, the specific method of operation proved incredibly difficult when the initial point of abduction was almost always shrouded in the shadows of the underground economy. The man orchestrating this nightmare was Gary Ridgway, a seemingly unremarkable commercial truck painter. His psychological profile defied the chaotic, disorganized traits often associated with such a high body count. Instead, Ridgway exhibited a terrifyingly organized, predatory patience. He used his mild-mannered appearance and a photograph of his young son to disarm his targets, weaponizing a facade of mundane safety. His vehicle became a mobile trap, seamlessly blending into the heavy traffic of the commercial strip. This camouflage of normalcy highlighted a deeply unsettling criminological concept often referred to as the less dead. It is a grim reality that society and media often allocate fewer resources and less urgency to victims deemed high risk or socially undesirable. Ridgway weaponized this bias. He understood implicitly that the disappearances of these specific women would not trigger the same immediate massive manhunts as the abduction of a suburban housewife. The societal blind spot became his operational sanctuary. His choice of disposal sites further insulated him from detection. The dense forests and deep ravines of the region offered natural concealment, while the Green River itself acted as a forensic cleansing agent. Water degrades physical trace evidence rapidly, washing away hair, fibers, and biological material that might otherwise link a suspect to a crime scene. By the time many of the remains were discovered, the elements had reduced them to skeletal puzzles, stripping away crucial clues. Confronted with this mounting crisis, authorities formed a dedicated task force, an operation that would eventually become the largest of its kind in United States history. The investigative room was a chaotic mosaic of thousands of tips, suspect profiles, and overlapping timelines. The sheer scale of the data was paralyzing. Without the immediate, localized panic that usually accompanies a serial predator, the task force was forced to sift through an ocean of noise, desperately searching for a single, actionable signal. The psychological burden on the detectives was immense, compounded by the killer's macabre habits. Ridgway frequently returned to the clandestine grave sites, engaging in necrophilia. This behavior points to a profound psychological need for absolute dominance and possession, extending his control long after the victim's death. These return visits were a high-risk activity, yet his confidence in the geographical isolation of his dumping grounds and the societal indifference toward his victims emboldened him. Unlike other high-profile predators of the era who sought media attention or engaged in elaborate cat-and-mouse games with the police, Ridgway operated with a silent, utilitarian efficiency. He did not write taunting letters. He did not seek the spotlight. His motivations were entirely internalized, driven by a deep-seated misogyny and an insatiable compulsion to kill, entirely devoid of the theatricality seen in other organized offenders. This lack of communication deprived profilers of vital psychological insights. How does a man responsible for dozens of murders maintain a facade of absolute normalcy? The psychological compartmentalization required to strangle a woman in the woods and then return home to a wife and steady job is staggering. Ridgway existed in two entirely separate dimensions, moving between the role of a banal blue-collar worker and an apex predator without fracturing his outward persona. This duality remains one of the most chilling aspects of his pathology. The investigation did brush against Ridgway multiple times during the height of the killings. He was arrested for a prostitution-related charge and even questioned as a suspect in the disappearances. In 1984, he passed a polygraph examination, a technological hurdle that inadvertently cleared him in the eyes of many investigators at the time. The reliance on the polygraph, a tool measuring physiological stress rather than absolute deception, proved to be a catastrophic misstep. Despite the polygraph results, a profound sense of suspicion lingered among a few key detectives. In 1987, authorities executed a search warrant on Ridgway's home and vehicles. While they failed to uncover definitive proof of murder, they made a decision that would alter the course of forensic history. They instructed Ridgway to chew on a piece of gauze, collecting a sample of his saliva. In the late 1980s, the application of this biological material was severely limited. As the decade bled into the 1990s, the active killing seemingly slowed, but the shadow of the predator continued to loom over Seattle. The unresolved grief of the families transformed into a chronic, regional trauma. Advocacy groups formed, fighting not just for justice, but for the basic recognition of the victim's humanity. The narrative slowly shifted, challenging the systemic biases that had allowed the killer to operate with such devastating impunity for so long. The human toll of this protracted investigation was immeasurable. Dozens of families lived in a state of ambiguous loss, a psychological purgatory where the absence of a body meant the absence of closure. The victims were reduced to numbers on a task force whiteboard, their individual stories eclipsed by the monstrous legacy of the man who took them. Restoring their identities became a secondary, yet equally vital mission for the forensic anthropologists working the case. The case eventually transitioned into a cold state, archived in countless boxes, a monument to investigative frustration. The initial detectives retired or moved on, haunted by the elusive phantom of the highway. Yet the physical evidence, meticulously preserved in climate-controlled storage, waited silently. It was a dormant arsenal, requiring only the right technological key to unlock the secrets bound within the degraded cellular structures. That key arrived at the dawn of the new millennium. The evolution of forensic science brought forth short tandem repeat, or STR, DNA profiling. This revolutionary technique allowed scientists to extract and amplify microscopic fragments of genetic material, generating a unique biological fingerprint even from highly degraded or minute samples. The limitations of the 1980s were suddenly shattered by the precision of modern molecular biology. In 2001, the Washington State Crime Lab revisited the cold case evidence. They extracted minute traces of semen recovered from 3 of the earliest victims. Using the new STR technology, they generated a pristine genetic profile of the killer. The final critical step was to compare this profile against the archived biological evidence collected from suspects over the decades. The investigators retrieved the saliva swab taken from the unassuming truck painter 14 years prior. The match was absolute. The microscopic strands of DNA bridged a gap of nearly 2 decades, definitively linking Gary Ridgway to the bodies pulled from the river. The statistical probability of a coincidental match was infinitesimal. The scientific certainty provided a stark contrast to the years of psychological profiling, circumstantial evidence, and investigative dead ends. The invisible predator had finally been illuminated by the undeniable light of his own biology. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest. The monster who had terrorized a region for a generation was not an evil genius or a transient drifter, but a man who had lived quietly in their midst. The legal strategy immediately shifted from identification to prosecution. Facing a mountain of incontrovertible scientific evidence and the very real threat of the death penalty, the defense team recognized that a trial would be a futile endeavor. To save his own life, Ridgway agreed to a controversial plea bargain. He would provide comprehensive, truthful confessions and lead authorities to the remains of the missing, in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the subsequent interrogations, the true depths of his psychopathy were laid bare. He recounted the murders with a chilling, flat affect, treating the destruction of human life as a mundane logistical exercise. His memory of the crimes was terrifyingly precise regarding geography, yet entirely devoid of empathy. He could recall the exact dirt roads and ravines where he disposed of the bodies, but often could not remember the faces or names of the women he had strangled. This detachment underscores the extreme objectification inherent in his crimes. To Ridgway, the victims were never human beings. They were merely vessels for his rage and subsequent disposal. The recovery efforts that followed were grim and painstaking. Guided by the killer, task force members returned to the overgrown sites they had scoured years before. The extraction of the remains provided a sobering physical reality to the confessions. It was a dark, unprecedented collaboration between law enforcement and a mass murderer, a necessary evil undertaken to bring a fractured sense of resolution to the families who had waited decades for answers. In 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a Seattle courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, a number that would later rise to 49. It remains the highest number of murder convictions for a serial killer in United States history. The courtroom was filled with the families of the victims, their raw, visceral grief finally colliding with the hollow, emotionless gaze of the man who had authored their suffering. The Green River case stands as a monumental pillar in the history of criminology. It is a masterclass in the terrifying intersection of predator psychology, societal vulnerability, and the slow, relentless march of forensic science. Ridgway's ability to evade capture was not born of exceptional brilliance, but of a calculated exploitation of a demographic the world was too eager to ignore. His strategy was brutal, simple, and devastatingly effective for far too long. Today, the legacy of the investigation is written in the protocols of modern law enforcement and the revolutionary power of DNA profiling. Yet the true weight of the case remains anchored in the dark waters and dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It is a haunting reminder that the most dangerous predators do not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, armed with the terrifying knowledge of exactly who society will not miss.